Our next speaker is someone I want to tell you a little bit about. He's former dean of the faculty I mentioned. Apart from that, he's been an instrumental organizer, activist behind the scenes with the PDRC. But it's difficult to get two sides of the Thai divide on the same panel. I want to thank Ajahn Charat in particular because this is short notice. Before this, we were going to have Professor Sujit, a drafter of the 1997 Constitution, senior fellow at ISIS, former dean. He was going to be the speaker here, but he fell ill suddenly. He's recovering now. But in the meantime, at that time, it was a Friday, I had to get someone who ideally is a drafter, a former drafter of the Constitution, who has knowledge of Thai politics and constitutionalism. And I rang Ajahn Charat, and he is a speaker that makes very little fuss. When you contact people, they say, "Oh, when is it? What are the details?" And they send me a letter of invitation and this and that. No fuss. He said, "What time is it?" I said, "Monday morning." He said, "Well, I think I can make it, but next week, I'm not sure about next week. This is this week." And I know that he's been very busy. I'm not sure how much sleep he got last night, because last night I was tuning into these two channels, the UDD channel and the Blue Sky channel, the UDD channel, Blue Sky channel. But then when the Blue Sky channel had Ajahn Charat on the stage, I tuned in, I stayed and listened to the whole remarks. Now, so we cannot have I think a more thoughtful, someone with impact, experience in constitutionalism, having drafted, been a part of the drafting committee of the 2007 Constitution. And we now are looking at the demands by the one side of the divide for reform. So perhaps we will hear from Professor Charat what kinds of reforms should we be looking at? What ails Thai constitutionalism? How do we move forward from here? Professor Charat.
Thank you, Professor Thitinan, and Your Excellency, Ambassador Richard, and ladies and gentlemen. I am very more than happy to share with the panel about my perception on the Constitution, and have to thank Professor Stein that kindly shared the Norwegian Constitution with us today. I want to follow Professor Pitt remarks on the views on Constitution that we have in Thailand. We regard the Constitution as a machine that run the country, the country politics, and perhaps it run the country economic as well. Okay, and with that kind of machine, we think we have to fix it if it didn't work. Okay, but our past experience, I think it is a driver that broke the car, not the car itself. But still, we often end up with change the car rather than fix the driver or change the driver. That's the case. Then we have how many 18 constitutions and already, but I think we are perhaps the 18 constitution. The number is higher than every country that I know. But we still aim higher. We want to make more constitution. So let me share with you the structure of constitution that we have so far. Perhaps to share with Professor Stein as well, because you kindly explained to us about the structure of the Norwegian Constitution. Actually, the philosophy of our Constitution partly come from our history. When we have, before we come to the constitutional democracy, we had been in the regimes of monarchy, the monarchist ruler. At that time, we have sort of not the constitution, but the political culture that rule the king, or the king use it. We call the 10 Testament. In Thai we call Totsapit Rajatham. 10 Testaments mean that it is the ruling law of the king. If the king rule the country on this law, the king become the philosophy king, the king that rule with wisdom, with selfless and with generosity, and will free from emotion and greedy. So that the 10 Testament. And when we change to the constitutional democracy, the philosophy of the Constitution has been sort of articulate to have the sovereign power of the country to be shared by the king and by the people. Okay, it has been prescribed in the Article 3 of the Constitution. I think every constitution would say that. In Thailand, I mean, the 18th Constitution would be the same. But the share of sovereign power between the king and the people are not equal. I mean, more to the people and less to the king. But probably it is not as the same as Norwegian. The king, especially the present king, tried to limit his power. He has been publicly give a speech again and again that the king would not, the king would decline to express his power. Try to limit it, and he never have it expressed that he want more power in the politics. But whenever we have a conflict between political fractions, like today, we often try to ask to the king to use the king's power. I mean, the king sovereign power, and the king, I think most of the time, and even today, the king would express his decline to do that kind of thing, because in the past, yes, the king with the king sovereign power, we can solve a lot of conflicts, many conflicts in the party. Even in the last 12 years, we have a big conflicts, and the king can use that. But less and less he tend to do that so far. That's the philosophy. The other part of the Constitution would be similar to Norwegian. I think we have articles that express the liberty, the freedom, to guarantee the right of the people, the fairness, equality, and that it's about the same for every constitution that we have in the past. But the other one that is a surprise to me that we have a sort of chapters about state policy guideline in Thailand. The state policy guideline is would address the detail of somehow the right to access to public service like education, health, and more we put more articles on this. Now it's called social policy, social access, something like that, and we tend to have a sort of popular constitution now, and I wonder if we have a new constitution, we would add more of this. While Norwegian try to limit it, right? the social guarantee for especially for the minorities and for the disparities in terms of groups of people. And then we have a principle of we put the new principle of public finance, the sound public finance in the 2007 Constitution. This is a new thing. the quite new chapter that we put in the 1997 Constitution is the decentralization in local government. That's the first time. And that's the key issue of reform that I myself particularly want to push for the reform in our country, because Thailand is one of the extremely centralized country in terms of administration and politics, and we have a big common pool finance at the center, and everyone from the region come to the center and trying to graft as much of the money from the center to their regions, and that can explain the politics so far. Okay, then we have a very a rather advanced constitution that we have the direct democracy chapters that people can participate in the law announcement, the initiation of the laws and the policy, but most of them not work very well in practices. The checks and balance mechanism that Michael just mentioned to you about the new checks and balance institution that we put on the Constitution since 1997, about the Constitutional Court, the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Election Commission, so on and so forth. This somehow worked well, but it created a lot of problem in our country. That's just an overview. You can look at the English version of our Constitution through the email. I think you can go to the 1997 or 2007 Constitution on the Google. You can find this in English version. My short remark is about the political crisis so far in relation to the Constitution. I think we can. You would surprise that we have a very long and detailed Constitution. One of the long and detailed Constitution. You have only how much 10, 12, 110 chapter article, but you have a long list of prescription about how to implement the Constitution. Right? We don't have that. Description of how to implement. We have a long and detailed Constitution. With this kind of detailed Constitution, we can expect that we shouldn't have any problems of interpretations, because it has been listed quite long and detailed. But when it comes to action, we have a lot of debate about the interpretation of the Constitution, whether it means for me or it's against me, my case, something like that. So many cases of the interpretation would go to the courts, the Constitutional Court. As you have seen, and Michael just mentioned about that, and surprisingly, we have a problem that those political fractions that dissatisfied with the court sentence, they decline to accept the court's sentence, the Constitutional Court sentence. You have heard about a paraphrase of political words about the double standard in Thailand. Yeah. Okay, the double standard means that the court shouldn't have that kind of sentence. It's biased to one fraction and not to the others. If you live in Thailand long enough, I think you wouldn't surprise about this kind of double standard words. It is perhaps, to me, it is a common to our lifestyle in Thailand. You go to the street, you look at the street level. We have had so many bad drivers who violate the traffic law, and the police didn't really want to enforce the law. They perhaps punctually did sometime, but they do for the sake of getting bribe from the bad drivers. Okay. But when the police strictly enforce the law and caught a bad driver, he would complain that the police practiced to him with the double standard, because he expected the police should not enforce the law to him as the police should do with the other. And that's the case of our country. To make it simple, I think we the word that the ambassador said in Norway, in the Norwegian people are very strict to the law, and the law they trust in the government and very strict to the law. In our country, that's exceptional. That is an exceptional. Very few people strict to the law. We often broke the law, and we expect that the enforcement of the law should not for me, but for the other, something like that. A more complicated issue about the Constitution is about the checks and balance mechanism, especially the Constitutional Court. Probably Michael has said something about this, and Professor Pitt have mentioned about this. We have a conflict between the Constitutional Court and the other two counterparts, the parliaments and the cabinet. There were cases in the past, last year, when the parliament passed the constitutional amendment resolution and subsequently passed the amnesty bill. And I think the other bill was passed to the $2 billion financing, debt financing. And the Constitutional Court sentenced that the passage of the bill were unconstitutional, against the Constitution. Then the parliaments and the cabinet, the other side, declined to accept the constitutional decision. They argue that the court's judgment intervene in the area of power of the legislative and the executive branches. I cannot go on discussing on this detail because you have to go to the constitutional court sentence and to go to the detail of the Constitution, what described about this. But just want to give you an example that we have a problems of implementing the Constitution in a country, which bring the conflicts and from the constitutional conflicts, then it lead to the legislative conflicts. The problems of legitimacy. When the government declined to accept the Constitutional Court sentence, and people said, if you violate the law, we shouldn't let you govern the country, something like that. So that is a problem that it has been going up. It's been going on how many, 6 months more? And probably this week I heard the PTRC is going to try to wrap up the conflicts and let it last probably next week. Hope it going on well, but that is the thing that I would like to share with you. Thank you very much.
ขอบคุณครับอาจารย์จรัส อาจารย์จรัส first could you just share with us a little bit about the reforms that you see at PRCC? I didn't prepare for that, but let me remind this.
there are 4 or 5 areas of reform that the PDRC proposed that they would like to go to do it. They mandate that the reform should come before elections, and not they didn't mean so against election, but they try to do some reform before election, because if it goes on with the same election process, then we could end up with the same vicious circle again. That's what they thought. But the reform would how many areas of reform? Okay, firstly is about the election reform. So elections is that they want to prevent the populist policy coming back again from elections. I mean, because in the past 10 years we have we have a growing up populist policy in the government, in the election campaigns, and that is one of the dangerous things for our country. The other one, not for that, just election process, but it related to the reforms of the political party as well. Our political party has been occupied by the money politics very much, and we have an idea that this party should be transformed, should be developed to a popular party, and a party for the people. We would like to install a sort of pre-elections or the election, the process of selecting the candidate should come from the pre-elections rather than from the party elite that can pick individual candidate on their own choice, something like that. The other is about the vote buying, which I doubt that we can solve the problem, but they want to decrease the vote buying if they can do. That perhaps the key issue of reforms in terms of politics and party. The second one that I know and then I'm particularly interested is about the decentralization. The reform is heading to have an elected governor of every province in the future, but we can start with the province that are ready to be self-governing body at the provincial level. This again, this is not a sort of an emergent issue. It is a long classical issue of our country that we try to promote decentralization, but we still end up with a sort of the national government and bureaucrat who don't want to evolve functions and resource to local government, and then we have a big problem with the big bureaucracy and a lot of things. So we want to overcome the problems of decentralization. Structurally, we have a very small unit of local government. Norwegian has a very small as well, we know. But you have a highly financially autonomous in terms of very strong local government. We have a weak local government because we have many of the rural areas that with a very small and mostly depend on the financial support from the central government, and we cannot cope with that. And with the small areas, we cannot allow them to provide such a big public service, high cost public service. So we want to enlarge the areas of local government and strengthen that with more resources. That's why we promote, we advocate the self-governing province in the reform. The other one is about the corruption and bureaucracy. You probably have heard about we have a problem of corruption and democracy. Again, this is not an emergent issue. It is a long and classic problems of Thailand, and it usually come out with a problems of legitimacy, political legitimacy, when the national government politicians come into power and corrupt through, vertically and horizontally. The corruption in our country has a very big network at all levels, actually. So how to solve that? By reforming the bureaucracy and put a more vigorous measure for combating with the corruption. Not quite sure what we can do in the short term, but that is one of the things. The other one is about the what we call social disparity, economic disparity between people in the city and in the countries, and people in the urban areas like Bangkok. We have thought about trying to reshape the natural resource management, like land, agricultural areas that we want to, if we can do, we want to change not change, but to reallocate that kind of ownership to the community. We have a good experience to have a community land ownership. We have done in some province nearby Bangkok, and trying to spread that to other places so that the agricultural sector can group together and have a common ownerships on the lands and other agricultural resources, so that they can we can alleviate the problems of the agricultural sector in terms of supply side. That's another problem. The supply side would then impact on the demand side as well. What else? That's the 4 or 5 areas. I couldn't give you in detail, partly because we don't have a detail, and partly because I couldn't remember. We have a 2 weeks workshops on the issue of reforms last month, and I hope we can come up with a sort of a document that we can spread to the public. Thank you.
Thank you. I counted 4 main areas of reforms: electoral reform, party system, perhaps a primary system before the election, pre-election, and to reduce vote buying. Second, decentralization, directly elected provincial governors, for example, in self-governing provinces, financial autonomy. 3, corruption and democracy, reducing corruption at all levels, the bureaucratic reforms, and then the disparity, the equality issue. Perhaps land reform, perhaps reallocation of land to local communities, and more ownership for local communities. Okay, so the floor is open for some discussion and questions or comments. We have about 15 minutes or so. Your turn.
Dieter Ande, I'm a publisher here. Can you, somebody please clarify the role of the Constitutional Court and how is it handled in other countries? My understanding is if a parliament makes a law which is, some people have doubt about it, they go to the Constitutional Court and ask, is this constitutional? And when the court says no, then simply this law cannot be implemented. But it seems here that the court punishes people who do this. Is this done in European countries also? That people who made, let's say, wrong decision in legislation, that they be punished?
Okay, any other question or comment with regard to Constitutional Court? Relationship between judiciary, court, legislature, executive, government?
I don't know much about the detail of it, but let me put it this way: that the Constitutional Court is a new trend of the democratic dynamism in many countries. Okay, it's a mechanism to counter the majority rule, but there are so many reasons. So many countries has this mechanism, but there's so many arguments pro and against it, right? But the way it's being implemented in Thailand right now is very interesting. That's why someone said it's a judicial coup. Someone said it's judicial crazy, right? The main principle, I think, probably in the German is probably the model of it, but the way it's being localized in many countries is different. Especially the way you get the Constitutional Court, right? The way the Constitutional Court is actually accountable for the people in Germany and in Thailand is not the same. But my point is that some theories say that the judicial court, the Constitutional Court, is kind of a mechanism to put the limit into the extreme majority rule. And it's also in many countries the transition of democracy took place when the elite or when the old people, the old group of people who was in power, when they agreed to step down, they put the Constitutional Court as one of the place where they can exercise their power as well. But the point is that when you make the judgment, right? I'm not going to go to the technical part, but the principle is to make sure that there's some principle that is actually more important than majority rule, and that will make democracy alive, which is the principle of rule of law, right? So basically you put the constraint into majority rule for the sake of the majority rule, so that they won't put the society into an extreme and they won't respect the minority group of the minority side. But the way it has been implemented, especially in Thailand, it's not really in that way. It's like the minority is right and the majority is wrong. Right? So not only the Constitutional Court, but also in many so-called independent organizations, sometimes especially the National Anti-Corruption Commissions, sometimes, I don't want to use the word slip of the tongue, but some of them give the public comment that, they really believe that the minority group is right. So this kind of thing, this is the big challenge of democracy. I'm not saying that we should not have the Constitutional Court, but I think the way they explain to the people, and this is it's very problematic. And what Ajahn Charas said, that the issue in Thailand is the implementation of the Constitution, and some group that actually does not really obey the Constitution. I think every group now does not really always obey the Constitution, right? How can we say that Suthep is obeying the Constitution, in which the Constitution is also put election is part of the very important part of how the machine should work, right? So it's this kind of the the perception over what Charas said of the double standard, right? Everybody put the blame on the other, right? And just a little bit on history part, the word rule of law came to Thailand very late in terms of the political discourse. It's new. It's been put into this current constitution for the first time. But the rhetoric itself of the rule of law came as the big discourse to counter Thaksin and to counter corruption. And it has been put into section 3 of the constitution. Very interesting, because in the old day, the anti-electoral movement was lacking of the discourse to counter the electoral force in Thailand. So what they used in the 1991 coup d'etat was the เผด็จการเสียงข้างมาก, right? The majoritarian dictatorship. But they still couldn't really come up with a very powerful word to put the constraint on that. Then the word rule of law came. But the function of it now is that when you use the rule of law and when you put the power into the constitutional court, in which they are facing the very big legitimacy crisis, right? Because the way they came did not really connect to the people. Right? So it's a big challenge that when you use the word rule of law and you only have one institution or one group of the constitution that does not really connect to the people, and it seems like they do the right thing, but there's so many ways that we can talk about the right thing in democracy, right? And then sometimes they also got accused that they actually expanding or extending their authority over what's been written in the constitution. But this is a matter of political struggle. It's a matter of the way of interpreting constitution. I think no one is absolutely right on this. Thanks.
Dr. Nelson.
Just one brief addition to Anders' question. I mean, I'm not an expert on international constitutional practice, but to my feeling, there is a peculiar connection between verdicts about constitutionalism of laws in Thailand and punishment. Normally, one would expect that if any government violates the constitution, this is undone by the verdict of the Constitution Court, but the government will not be punished. One example in Germany is quite recent. That is, the Constitution Court said that the German election law was unconstitutional, and it mandated the government and the parliament to amend the election law. The government did that, and the Constitution Court said that's not enough. You have to do more than that. So government and parliament had to enter into another round of amendment of the election law. But of course, nobody would have thought of the idea that the first time the government did not comply with the Constitution Court verdict, and then the second time they did. So after this first time, should the Constitution Court have also disqualified the German government because they had not performed according to the verdict of the Constitution Court? Of course, the government stayed in power, but they had to do another round of election law amendments. I see the development of the Constitution Court was rather with a very uncomfortable feeling because, well, my background is German, so I like a strong constitutional court in order to keep checks on powers. But I also see that the verdicts of the Constitutional Court in the past few years have been highly problematic, often partisan, often rather unprofessional in terms of interpreting the law. So it is right to say that people have to follow the verdicts of the Constitutional Court. But the first thing is that the Constitutional Court must earn the reputation and the respect of the public. If the Constitutional Court comes to verdicts that are highly questionable or even itself violates the constitutions, it is very hard to ask people to pay respect to the verdicts and act according to what the Constitutional Court says. So what I would have in mind is a Constitutional Court that is above petty politics and takes the Constitution seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Stein, in Norway, you don't have a constitutional court. Did the Norwegians, did they think of having one? And why not?
This is the job of the Supreme Court. Part of the job of the Supreme Court to review the government's administrative decisions and the legislation if it's in consonance with the Constitution. And it's done strictly in matters where there is a clear idea of a conflict with certain parts of the Constitution. The one case we had recently was about one article in the Constitution that says that no law can have retroactive effect. And then there was a certain taxation regime that was adopted, which was then claimed to have had a retroactive effect on Norwegian ship owners. And this then became overruled. But that was actually the EEA that did it, because the Supreme Court accepted it. So it was accepted in Norway, but then under the EEA rules in Europe, it was overruled. So that was actually a matter of sovereignty as well. But in matters like the ones we've seen taken up with the Constitutional Court in Thailand, it would be absolutely unthinkable, I think, because they are clearly would in Norway be seen as clearly political. For the government to take the initiative to amend the Constitution, if the government wanted to amend the Constitution, then that would not be unconstitutional. It would be unconstitutional, of course, to force it through without the 2/3 majority to follow the rules for how to amend. But the government can take any initiative to amend the Constitution with impunity. The other little remark I wanted to just mention is just something that struck me when I read the Constitution, something I didn't know that was in the Norwegian Constitution before I read it shortly ago, and that was a rule against vote buying. Because I can't remember having heard about votes being bought in Norway. But that must have happened once in a while anyhow, because in the constitutional text it says that anyone who's caught for selling or buying votes will lose voting rights. So that's one of the crimes that will result in your losing your right to vote. The third little remark I wanted to make is just to declare myself in complete agreement with Michael Nelson about what you said about an emergency. I should clarify that what this volume in the Norwegian book series has found is that if it's an emergency situation caused by internal power struggles, that's the situation that we think creates constitutions that cannot survive. If you have a national emergency where several national factions need a constitution for external purposes or to get out of a crisis, and where they find some kind of general compromise, then it can work. And I think both Germany and Japan, also post-war, with a constitution written mostly by Americans, it has survived too for a long time now. And I'm afraid that you don't really need a long time to study, this Norwegian constitution was written in a very short time, and it was in a national emergency. There were parties as well who disagreed, because there was a unionist party that wanted to accept the union with Sweden. and there was another party that wanted either independence or to remain with Denmark or get back to Denmark if that would be possible later on. And both of those two parties needed some kind of constitution at that time to restrain the power of the king, regardless of who it would be, because that was what they wanted on both sides. So they arrived at a kind of national compromise in an emergency situation.
Yes, just want to add on your argument on your question about the practice of Thailand. Perhaps the rule of law in Thailand that we have put on the constitution and the notion of majority rule and minority right in your country would be about the same thing, but we apply in a different directions. With the rule of law, we put some of the limitations of the government's power and executive powers, as well as the legislative power too. I mean, and then when we come to a complicated case in Thailand, for example, when the government amend the constitution, I mean the constitution amendment resolution, and when it go to the constitutional court said the sentence is unconstitutional. Well, actually, I think the case of unconstitutional would be either simple or complicated. The simple is that if the behavior of unconstitutional is just that and no other else, nothing else, perhaps there is no punishment. The government can have to stop that. I mean, they cannot do that, and they can have to amend the thing, and they can stay in power too. Like last year, we have one of the governments behave for unconstitutional, but they can still work together. But if the case become more complicated, for example, they behave unconstitutionally and they intentionally abuse the power to benefit somebody by using the majority rule, then it become a sort of political crime. That kind of abuse of power. If that is the case too, then the Constitution might consider the abuse of the power to be pernicious. Okay, you would know that there are cases that last 2 years perhaps I didn't realize it very well about the government, the legislative body passed the law and the constitution said it's unconstitutional, so the parliament just come back and amend it and with the government. But that is a very simple case. Okay, and there are cases of the amnesty law, amnesty bill, that it has been sentenced as unconstitutional, and with that the complication is that the passage of the amnesty bill is to favor the, how should I say, frankly, to benefit the ex-prime minister who now is exiled abroad, and the groups of the one that committed crime last 3 years ago. That amnesty bill has been sentenced as unconstitutional, and the abuse of power, of majority rule too. So perhaps the court had limited sovereign power to do too, but I agree with Professor Pitch that somehow we have a problem. So we have a big argument on the areas of power of our constitutional court and legislative bodies, and as well as the government and the executive body too. This is perhaps we didn't we're not accustomed to the rule of law yet. we often decline to obey the law too much in the past. Now we have to used to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've run out of time, so I'm going to bring this to an end. Constitutionalism in Thailand is stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's very difficult. If we go with the majority rule, legislative authority, then as in the case of the amnesty, it would pass because they have the votes. But then it could be abused and manipulated. But then fixing that could lead to the opposite kind of problems. It lacks popular mandate and so on. So somehow, as in your case, in our country, is evolving. I think that this is all about the crux of the crisis in Thailand. What kinds of rules? And now with this 309 articles, we have 309. Each side, different groups, they have their own articles. Right? So you go to your articles, and there is at this time no final arbiter that people would accept. And hence we will have, I'm afraid, more contestation. Please join me. First, I want to say congratulations to Norway for 200 years of constitution, one of the oldest in the world. Thank you for working with us today, and also thank you for giving us a channel to talk about Thai politics, constitutionalism. I also want to thank the panelists, Ajahn Pitt, Dr. Michael Nelson, and Professor Charas, Professor Stein, for your valuable time flying in from Norway, but also taking time out from activism, and with the experts on constitution, Dr. Nelson and Dr. Pitt. Thank you very much, and thank you all of you for coming.